Welcome to Whispers of the Past, where forgotten tales return to life. The wind rolled across the Montana plains with a lonely whistle, tugging at the loose boards of the old Miller Ranch house. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low, throwing long shadows across the room. Ethan Miller stood in the rocking chair, boots still dusted from a long day in the fields, holding his newborn daughter close to his chest. The baby's breathing was uneven, punctuated by little cries, and every time she stirred, Ethan's arms tightened, as though his sheer strength could shield her from a world she had barely entered. His eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness, his jaw lined with exhaustion, but he refused to let go. It had been only 3 weeks since his wife, Clara, had slipped away in the quiet hours of dawn. The childbirth had been long and brutal. Ethan had paced the hallway, hat twisting in his hands, while the midwife worked. He remembered the screams, the sudden silence, and then the first frail cry of the child, and then the words he had never expected to hear. Clara hadn't made it. That moment had cut him deeper than any wound he had ever known, deeper than the losses of livestock, deeper than the harsh winters that stripped the ranch bare. It had cut into the very marrow of his life. Now the house that once carried laughter and warm meals felt hollow. The cradle that Clara had picked out sat beside the bed, but Ethan rarely laid the baby down. He was afraid she would cry in the night, and he wouldn't hear her. He was afraid something would happen if she wasn't in his arms. The rancher who had once faced wild stallions and blizzards with steel resolve now trembled when the tiny fist of his daughter curled against his shirt. The days blurred together. He woke before sunrise as he always had, but now there was no coffee waiting on the stove, no gentle voice telling him to eat something before heading out. He carried Grace with him to the barn, tucking her into a sling Clara had soon before the birth. He tried to pitch hay with one hand, milk the cows, and check the fences while she fussed and whimpered against his chest. Neighbors offered to help, but Ethan turned them away with a polite shake of his head. Pride was a heavy yoke, and grief had made it heavier. He didn't want pity. He didn't want curious looks. He wanted his wife back. And since that was impossible, he wanted to be left alone. But grief has a way of drawing eyes, and Ethan's solitude was not as private as he wished. One evening, when the sun was bleeding gold across the horizon and the cicadas sang their rough song, a wagon rolled up the long dirt road to his ranch. The sound of wheels crunching against gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Grace had just fallen asleep in his arms after hours of colicky crying. Ethan shifted her, gently frowning when he saw the shape of a woman climbing down from the wagon with a basket in her hands. Mrs. Clara Dawson was known throughout the county as a woman who made things happen. She was older, stout, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for matchmaking that had left many men both grateful and mildly resentful. She believed every household needed the right pair of hands and hearts to make it whole, and she took it upon herself to see to it. Ethan had known her since he was a boy. She had been a friend of his late mother, and she had, more than once, tried to convince him to marry before he had chosen Clara. He remembered her smile at his wedding, smug and satisfied, as though she had personally authored his happiness. Now, standing in the doorway of his lonely house, Ethan felt his shoulders tense. He had no desire for company, least of all from Clara Dawson with her sharp tongue and sharper wisdom. But she was already inside, pushing the door open with her hip, balancing her basket on her arm. The smell of fresh bread and roasted chicken filled the room, making Ethan's stomach twist with hunger. He hadn't eaten more than a few bites that day, but he still frowned. "You didn't have to come all this way," he muttered, rocking Grace gently, hoping the baby wouldn't wake. "Nonsense," Mrs. Dawson replied briskly, setting the basket on the table. "A man can't live on stubbornness alone. I see your boots, I see your face, and I know you haven't had a decent meal in days. You think a baby can thrive on a father who forgets to feed himself?" Ethan opened his mouth, but she waved him off with one hand. She moved about the kitchen as though it were her own, pulling out plates, setting the bread down, clucking under her breath at the dust she found on the shelves. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling like a boy again, being scolded for chores left undone. Grace stirred, her small mouth opening in a soft cry. Ethan's heart clenched, and he tightened his hold. Mrs. Dawson's sharp eyes softened as she turned toward him. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Let me hold her," she said gently. Ethan shook his head. "She's fine, Ethan Miller," she said, her tone taking on the familiar weight of authority he had known since childhood. "If you don't let someone else hold that child once in a while, you're going to collapse right where you stand. Hand her over before you fall over." Reluctantly, and with the hesitance of a man handing over his very heart, Ethan placed the baby in Mrs. Dawson's arms. She took Grace with practiced ease, cradling her close, humming under her breath. Grace quieted almost instantly, her cries softening into tiny hiccups. Ethan exhaled, surprised at the relief that washed over him when his arms were free. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching the older woman sway gently with his child. Something about the scene reminded him of what he had lost, the tenderness of a mother's touch, the presence of a woman in the house. It was almost unbearable, and he turned away, staring at the fire instead. "I told you, Ethan," Mrs. Dawson said quietly, her eyes fixed on the baby. "I told you years ago, you needed a wife. A ranch can't run on muscle alone, and a baby can't grow on grief." Her words cut through the silence, not cruelly, but with a blunt truth he couldn't ignore. He clenched his fists, staring into the fire until the heat stung his eyes. "I had a wife," he said finally, his voice low, rough. "And I lost her." Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. She didn't argue, didn't remind him of the obvious. Instead, she shifted Grace in her arms and rocked a little more, letting the silence stretch. After a while she said, "You loved Clara. Anyone could see it, and she loved you. But Ethan, love doesn't end with loss. It changes, it aches, it lingers, but it doesn't end. And it doesn't mean your life is over either." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to answer. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. He wanted to shout, to tell her she didn't understand, but he knew she did. Mrs. Dawson had buried her own husband decades ago. She had raised 3 children on her own before she'd taken to matchmaking. She knew grief better than most. The rest of the evening passed in quiet. Mrs. Dawson insisted he eat, and though the food felt heavy in his stomach, it was the first real meal he had managed in days. She left just before the moon rose, leaving the basket and a final pat on his shoulder. Grace was asleep again, swaddled tightly, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Ethan stood at the window long after the wagon disappeared down the road. The house was quiet once more, but Mrs. Dawson's words lingered. He didn't want to admit she was right. Not now, not so soon. His heart was still raw, his grief still bleeding. But as he looked down at the baby in the cradle, her face soft in sleep, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't do this alone forever. That night, as the wind howled across the plains and the fire burned low, Ethan sat beside the cradle, head in his hands, torn between the weight of the past and the uncertain promise of the future. The following weeks passed in a blur of long days and longer nights. Winter was pressing its hand against the Montana hills, turning the wind colder and the skies grey. Ethan Miller had fallen into a rhythm, though not one he would call steady. He woke at dawn, fed the livestock with Grace, strapped close to his chest, tried to mend fences with one hand, and rocked his daughter through the endless evenings of her restless cries. He was worn thin, his body aching in ways it never had before, not from hard labor but from the constant, knowing demand of fatherhood without a partner's hand to share it. Yet even as he insisted he could manage, Mrs. Dawson kept appearing at his door. Sometimes it was with food, sometimes with stern words, and sometimes with nothing more than her presence. Ethan both dreaded and depended on her visits. She reminded him that the world still saw him, still expected things from him, even while his grief told him to turn inward and shut it all out. One late afternoon, with snow dusting the ground and the cattle lowing in the distance, Mrs. Dawson arrived again. This time she wasn't alone. A woman stepped down from the wagon beside her, a figure Ethan had seen only once before at the small church in town. She was tall, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and her hands clutched a small parcel close to her chest. Ethan narrowed his eyes, suspicion tightening his jaw. He knew at once what Mrs. Dawson was up to. Ethan Miller. The older woman called, her voice brisk as ever. "This here is Mrs. Anna Carter. She's come into town recently, and she's been staying in a room above the schoolhouse. Teaches the children their letters, keeps them out of trouble. She insisted on meeting your little one." Ethan shifted Grace in his arms, the baby fussing against his chest. His instincts bristled. He didn't want strangers, least of all women chosen by Mrs. Dawson's scheming hand, poking their way into his life. He opened his mouth to send them both away, but Anna Carter stepped forward before he could speak. "I brought a small blanket," she said softly, holding out the parcel. Her voice was steady but carried a gentleness that made Ethan pause. "I made it myself. I thought your daughter might be warmer with something soft." Well, for a moment, the rancher just stared. He wasn't used to gifts, not since Clara had died. He wasn't used to kindness that came without pity. Anna's eyes didn't hold judgment, only sincerity. He hesitated, then reached out with one rough hand to take the blanket. Grace whimpered, and he instinctively shifted her closer. "Thank you," he muttered, his tone rough, though it carried more weight than the two words usually did. Anna smiled faintly, and Mrs. Dawson's eyes glittered with triumph. The first visit was brief. Anna stayed only long enough to sit near the fire, ask a few quiet questions about the baby, and then excuse herself politely. Ethan thought that would be the end of it, but Mrs. Dawson was not a woman who believed in half measures. A few days later, Anna returned, this time on her own, with a basket of small books and a warm pie wrapped in cloth. She said she thought Grace might benefit from being read to, even at her age, that a familiar voice and rhythm might soothe her restless nights. Ethan had almost laughed at the thought, but something about Anna's gentle conviction stilled his tongue. He let her stay, let her read aloud in her calm, lilting voice while he fed logs to the fire. Grace settled into a rare peace that evening, and Ethan found himself listening, the cadence of Anna's words weaving into the quiet of the room. As the weeks turned, Anna became a fixture in their lives. She didn't come every day, but often enough that Grace began to recognize her. Ethan noticed how his daughter's little arms would relax when Anna held her, how her eyes seemed to focus more on the sound of Anna's voice. At first, he told himself he tolerated these visits only because they helped Grace, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The house felt less empty when Anna was there. The silence wasn't so heavy. Still, Ethan fought against the stirring in his chest. He loved his late wife deeply, and every time Anna's presence warmed the room, he felt a sharp pang of guilt. To smile at another woman, to notice the way her hair slipped loose around her face, or the way her laughter filled the air. It felt like betrayal. He told himself to keep his distance, to guard his heart, but grief has a way of softening into longing, and loneliness makes even the strongest men weak. One evening, after a long day spent repairing a broken fence post in the biting cold, Ethan found Anna already in his kitchen. Mrs. Dawson had sent her with a pot of stew, and Grace was resting peacefully in her arms. Ethan stood in the doorway, boots heavy with snow, watching the scene unfold. Anna swayed gently, humming a tune under her breath, her eyes fixed tenderly on the infant. For a moment, Ethan's chest tightened so fiercely he thought he might break. The sight was so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of Clara, and yet so different. Anna looked up and caught his gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to set the baby down. Instead, she smiled, and in that smile was no pretense, no pity, only quiet companionship. Ethan drew in a breath and hung his coat by the door, saying nothing. They ate together that night, the clatter of spoons against bowls filling the room. Grace slept soundly in her cradle, and for the first time in months, Ethan found himself speaking of more than chores and weather. He told Anna about the land, about the way the hills turned gold in late summer, about the long winters that could test a man's resolve. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions, her eyes alight with curiosity. Her presence was steady, grounding, and Ethan felt himself loosening, word by word, as though some frozen part of him had begun to thaw. But the thaw was not without fear. After she left that evening, Ethan sat by the fire long into the night, staring at the blanket Anna had made. He ran his fingers over the careful stitches, each one a mark of patience, of care. He thought of Clara, of the promises he had made at her graveside, of the ache that still clawed at him when he woke alone. Could he dare allow someone else into his life? Could he open that wound again, risk the pain of loss once more? The question circled his mind without answer. Mrs. Dawson, however, had answers enough for both of them. The next time she visited, she wasted no time in making her opinion known. "You see now, don't you?" she said, hands on her hips, her eyes sharp as knives. "That woman has a heart as steady as the land you work. She doesn't pity you, she doesn't hover. She gives what she can and asks for nothing. That's the kind of woman you need." Ethan bristled. "I don't need anyone," he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Mrs. Dawson only shook her head. "A man who says he needs no one is usually the one in greatest need. And I'll tell you plain, Ethan Miller, you're not doing your daughter any favors by walling off your heart. That child deserves a home filled with more than silence and sorrow." Her words stung, but they lodged deep, and in the quiet of the night, Ethan admitted she was right. Grace deserved more than his brokenness. She deserved laughter, tenderness, and a mother's touch. He could not bring Clara back, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could build something new. Time moved gently forward. Anna's visits became part of the fabric of their days. She read stories by the fire, helped with small chores, and laughed easily with Grace balanced on her hip. Ethan found himself looking forward to those moments, though he tried not to show it. He noticed how her presence eased the heaviness in his chest, how her calm steadied the storm inside him. He noticed, too, the way her eyes lingered on him sometimes, not with expectation but with quiet understanding. It wasn't until spring touched the edges of the land, softening the snow into streams and painting the fields with green, that Ethan allowed himself to truly see what had been growing between them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, he stood on the porch with Anna at his side. Grace slept in Anna's arms, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of the blanket Anna had made months before. The air was cool, carrying the smell of earth and grass. Ethan looked out at the land he had worked all his life, the cattle grazing in the distance, the barn standing sturdy against the horizon. For so long, all he had seen was the emptiness Clara's death had left. But now, standing beside Anna, he saw possibility. He saw not just survival but life. He turned to her, words caught in his throat. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, at the softness of her features in the fading light, at the quiet strength in her posture. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "You've given more to us than I can ever repay," he said. "More than I deserved. I don't know what this means or what it might become. But I know this. When you're here, it feels like the house has a heartbeat again." Anna's eyes softened and a smile touched her lips. She said nothing at first, only shifted Grace gently in her arms and looked out at the land with him. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady. "Sometimes, Ethan, we don't choose the life we thought we'd have. But that doesn't mean what's left can't still be good." The words lingered between them, warm and true. And for the first time since Clara's passing, Ethan felt something stir in his chest that was not grief, but hope. Later that night, as Mrs. Dawson sat rocking in her chair on the porch, she caught the look between them, the look that spoke of healing, of something fragile but real taking root. She smiled to herself, her mission quietly fulfilled. "You were right," Ethan admitted softly to her, his voice carrying into the twilight. "I did need a wife." Mrs. Dawson chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "Took you long enough, rancher." And as the stars spilled across the vast Montana sky, Ethan knew his heart and his home were no longer bound to sorrow. They were bound to the promise of something new.